Section 8.3 Elaboration on Key Fundamentals Liquidity, starting off with a quality return to zone. It is very important that you guys are able to identify a quality return to zone because it lays the foundation of our high probability ranging environments and therefore also our high probability TCT models. A quality return to zone represents either a high probability liquidity curve or a high probability trendline liquidity pool, which on its own represents either highs getting stacked within an accumulation model or lows getting stacked within a distribution model. And within our quality return to zone, we have primary highs getting stacked and internal highs getting stacked. And a combination of both increase the probability of the return to zone. So as you can see here, we have a ranging environment that is creating a potential model 2 accumulation schematic here. And we can see that we have this buy side liquidity curve getting generated. Our primary highs are our visible pivot points within our liquidity curve and are typically also the highs that we tend to connect the liquidity curve with. So right here we can see connection points starting off. Right there it touched the liquidity curve, and then that range high also touches the liquidity curve. In between that, we have two very obvious lower highs as well. They don't all need to connect. We usually want a few connecting points to have a proper liquidity curve. But our visible pivot points within the range are our primary highs. And typically, you want each primary high to be a lower high compared to the previous one, or preferably also all supply created within a primary high, if any supply is created at all, you would like that to get mitigated on the second primary high creation. So you don't have any supply that's protecting price from coming to that range high in case of an accumulation model. But our primary high are our visible pivot points and are typically the pivot points used to connect the liquidity curve within the range. Our internal highs are the high creations in between our primary highs, where you can see here in red that I'm representing lower time frame structure right there. That's also all making lower highs and lower lows compared to the previous one. Where in between these primary highs, we also have these lower highs getting stacked. Your internal highs do not need to be actual valid market structure pools. They can also simply be individual candles highs getting stacked, where just the highs of each candle here is just going lower than the previous candle high. It doesn't need to be valid structure. They're just highs from an individual candle perspective getting stacked. And when you have primary highs, where each primary high is a lower high compared to the previous one, where there's no supply left unmitigated, the moment you're looking to confirm an entry here, and in between the primary highs, we have lots of individual candles highs also stacking up, that creates a very high probability return to zone because our primary highs and our internal highs are all stacking up buy side liquidity above. And for a distribution model, this is the exact opposite way, where we can simply invert the chart here and see that we have primary lows that are all stacking up to be higher lows, or preferably on each higher low mitigation, you mitigate any demand created in between that previous primary low point. And then in between these primary lows, we are stacking up either lower time frame structure lows or simply individual candle lows that are also all stacking up, indicating that there's almost nothing other than sell side liquidity below, making it very easy to confirm a rotation back down. An order block an OBIF, order block with inefficiency, in the middle of our quality liquidity curve does not invalidate the entire return to zone. Again, an order block, a single order block in the middle of the liquidity curve does not invalidate the entire return to zone. If the order block is located in between the internal highs, we can completely ignore it because it's worthless. If it's located in an actual pivot point of our primary highs, we need to put it on the chart and we need to be aware of it. And it is a POY that price could reject from. But if everything around that order block is developing in a high probability fashion, the rejection from the block will probably be just temporary before eventually making its way to the technical target. So catching actual order block creations in here in these pivot points, those are worth having on your chart if they're left unmitigated. Getting tiny low time frame blocks in between these internal highs, they are worthless. They are insignificant to the grander scheme of things. And this will also get more clear when we're going to be looking at live trading examples. And it will also get more clear when we're diving deep into high probability supply and demand levels. But for now, if you have an order block, let's say there's an order block right here in that pivot point, a good looking supply POY, but besides that order block, everything else still has primary highs getting stacked, on the lower time from here, internal highs getting stacked, then this order block does not invalidate the entire return to zone. It's just a POY that we need to be aware of. And then maybe it's going to be a POY where we will be taking partial profits to de-risk our position. But typically speaking, you will just get a temporary rejection if you get a rejection at all, and you will eventually make your way back up to the technical target, which is the range high. Second, it is very important that you understand the difference between a liquidity high and low versus a high and low that grab liquidity. So, if a high grabs the liquidity from a previous high, as you can see right here, that high is not a liquidity target because the high grabbed liquidity on the left. So typically speaking, we have highs that are all stacking up, and the people that short the high tend to put their stop loss below the previous swing point, and therefore on all these lower highs, we can see a lot of liquidity getting generated. But if that high grabs the liquidity from there, retail isn't shorting exact pivot points. So this high is not liquidity because it grabbed the liquidity on the left. And oftentimes, what you'll see is some sort of a more aggressive expansion towards the downside from it. So then if you have a high that grabbed liquidity and gets some more aggressive expansion towards the downside, you are also vulnerable to creating supply right there. And if you have supply backing up that high right there and the high grab liquidity, that is not a liquidity target. And this is very important to understand when we're going to be looking at our extreme liquidity POYs within our TCT models to confirm third taps from a Model 2 perspective. So if a high grabbed liquidity and created supply in the process, that high is not a liquidity high and should not be part of your return to zone. Afterwards, you can see here that we are stacking up lower highs. And the purpose of each high right here is simply to mitigate supply on the left and create lower highs. Where here we can see that buy-side liquidity curve getting generated. Because these are all lower highs compared to that high right there. This high grabbed the liquidity from that high and is therefore not a liquidity high. These highs are our liquidity highs. Because after that rejection back down, we create these lower highs where each lower high mitigates the supply of that previous point, and we can stack these highs all nice up together because we are slowly coming down. And we don't have that fast and aggressive price action in here that's also creating supply in the process. The exact same thing applies from a liquidity low perspective. If we have a low right here, and this low grabbed the liquidity from that low and got a V-shaped move back up, creating inefficiency, most likely also creating some sort of a demand POI, this is not a liquidity low, because the purpose of the low wasn't to generate liquidity, it was to grab liquidity on the left. Afterwards, right here, we can see all these higher lows stack up, where each low is a higher low compared to the previous one, and is mitigating all the demand on each lower or higher low mitigation. And we're going up slowly here, creating again that beautiful sell side liquidity curve. So a high or low that grabs liquidity isn't automatically a liquidity high or a liquidity low. Very important to understand, because it will prevent you from using the incorrect third tap POIs when we're looking at potential Model 2 TCT models. Okay? Now, an exception of this is if price grabs the liquidity high or grabs the liquidity low, but immediately starts creating price action nearby that high or nearby that low, not leaving behind any supply or demand or inefficiency. So right here, we can see that this high right there sweeps the liquidity of the previous high, and initially speaking, this high is therefore not a liquidity target because it grabbed the liquidity of the previous swing point. However, afterwards, price retraced back, mitigated all that was left to mitigate in there, and created highs nearby that high. This high initially does not hold liquidity because it grabbed the liquidity on the left. But because you have price coming nearby that high right there, people that short in between this region, again, tend to put their stop loss below that previous swing point. So the more time you spend nearby that high, the more buys and sells that get generated in this area, the more liquidity that gets generated above that high, because people tend to put their stop loss above a previous swing point, a nearby swing point. Very important. Okay? So if price is coming nearby that high again and is spending time there, you are generating liquidity above that high. And then if you can connect a proper return to zone, in this case a beautiful buy side liquidity curve, this high does become part of the liquidity trail. Only if price does not create any supply there and is spending time nearby that high. Because initially the high doesn't hold liquidity, but because the more time we spent in here, the more liquidity that gets generated above that, because the sell orders coming in that ranging environment, the people tend to put their stop loss below that previous swing point, which is going to be that high. So here, we're coming down fast, not spending any time there, and therefore that is not a liquidity high, and this is the liquidity. Here, we're spending price nearby that high, and therefore that high automatically becomes, over time, a liquidity high again. And the exact same applies from a liquidity low perspective, where if we grab the liquidity on the left here, this low initially does not hold liquidity, but because price comes nearby it, maybe mitigating any demand that was there to mitigate, and we're spending time in this environment, liquidity is getting built below that low again. And then when you can draw a liquidity curve from that low, connecting all these higher lows together, which looks like the proper high probability sell side liquidity curve, then we can use that low as a liquidity target again. But only if we spend time around that liquidity low, stacking up lows, causing us to draw to allow us to draw that liquidity curve again. And this is going to be very crucial to understand here when we're looking again at our Model 2 POIs in our TCT schematics, which we're going to be diving into in the next video.